Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to advertise, as I usually do here. We have a talk that's come up at relatively short notice. We're very pleased to have a joint CERC-AIS lecture next week with Jack Goldstone, a well-known theorist of revolutions and other areas of political science. His topic is what makes democracy work and why Hong Kong is not working. On March 21st, we have Dr. Brooke Shedneck, who's speaking on the Buddhist teachings today in the context of Thailand. And last but not least, as I've mentioned before, we have a workshop on the Singapore model and its influence on China. That's on the 9th of April. For those interested, please email Irene at the CERC office. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Teresita Cruz del Rosario, who is a senior research fellow at the Asia Research Institute, better known as ARI, at the National University of Singapore. I should say that Tess is well known to many of us here, a friend from many of us who have been in Singapore and elsewhere where you've been. I want to apologize again for the fact that Hong Kong is so cold. It's a bit like Romania in the 1980s here without heating sometimes, but this room turns out to be relatively warm, which is encouraging. Tess has a background in sociology, social anthropology, and public administration from Boston College, from Harvard University, and from New York University. Apart from her peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, her publications include a book entitled The State and the Advocate, Development Policy in Asia, and the forthcoming book, which is related to her topic here today, Lost in Transition, Comparative Political Transitions in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, Palgrave, which is forthcoming this year. Her current research interests are the broad field of Arab, Asian, historical, and sociological connections, with specific emphasis on religious pluralism, religious conversion, diaspora, and comparative regional development. I'm also very grateful that Tess, I think this is the first time we've had the working paper in advance of the talk, and it's been distributed to everybody here. If you didn't receive a copy, there's some more copies here to take afterwards. We're very pleased that you've come, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to this presentation. And thank you, Mark, for this very gracious invitation. Let me start by saying that a colleague of mine at IRIS says all ideas are biographical. And so what I thought I would do is to very briefly give you a biographical background to this research project. In 2013, my partner and co-author lived in Bangkok, where we stayed for 2 years. And during that period, we witnessed firsthand the beginnings of a relatively small protest that started right about the Soi, the street where we lived. And from that vantage point of our 26th floor balcony, witnessed this small protest that in the course of a few days very quickly escalated into a nationwide protest that practically paralyzed Bangkok. So by December of that year, the central district of Bangkok was effectively closed, not by Christmas revelers and shoppers, but by the street protesters who wanted to, among other things, bring down the government of Yingluck Shinawatra, who was the sister of the infamous Thaksin Shinawatra. So what they did was they effectively paralyzed transportation, invaded government offices nearby, and transformed the business district into a street market of hawkers with vendors selling t-shirts that read, Bangkok Reboot. Our favorite mall, the Paragon, was closed for nearly 6 months because the shops dared not to open. And while we were having a ringside view of this particular phenomenon, we decided, since my partner at that time was also doing on-the-ground field reporting in the Middle East, and the Arab Spring was, and the counter-revolution was in full swing, that we thought, why don't we put our hunches into more systematic research? Because also during that year, I had traveled back and forth a lot to Myanmar, where a very deep social, political, economic transformation was also taking place. And also, by the time we left Bangkok, Tunisia, the only bright spot in the Middle East and North Africa, was awarded the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize because of their contribution to building a pluralistic democracy. Then in late 2014, September, Mark, together with his other colleagues, Daryl, organized APISA. And this is where the first co-authored paper came out, in which we took a first stab at doing comparative analysis for these two regions, focusing on their political transitions. Eventually, we decided we were going to write a book, and this will be published by Palgrave this year under the series The Modern Muslim World. So for the next 45 minutes, I hope that I will have enough time and space to synthesize the findings of this research and engage you in a Q&A immediately after. So let's begin. Ideas and photographs are also biographical. This is a photograph of a workshop in Myanmar, in Mandalay, in 2005, which I took at the time. I was visiting professor at the Thammasat University, and we were asked to go into Myanmar to oversee a workshop on solid waste management. What was remarkable was that the workshop could not open or close without the generals. And these are some of the generals who were so enamored by a laptop. And the person on the right was a professor on environmental management, showing them how to navigate through the laptop. And that has become sort of an iconic image for me in terms of what Myanmar has been going through since 2005 and possibly earlier, that culminated in the 2012 by-elections and then the elections of 2015. Okay, so what I'm going to do this afternoon is take you on a whirlwind tour of two very massive, diverse, complex regions. These two regions are undergoing, in our view, very intense political transitions and transformations, but are qualitatively different from one another. Indonesia has completed a very successful national election in 2014 and has had several rounds of credible elections since its political transition in 1997. Remember, I am doing this very comparatively, so everything is in relative terms. So when I say successful, I always mean it's relatively successful compared to what is happening, for example, in Libya today. Myanmar, well, okay, the Philippines was ahead of Indonesia by at least a decade, and Myanmar is also going through a dramatic transition on all fronts since its last election in November 2015 that was by and large viewed as largely legitimate. In contrast, Middle Eastern and North African countries that have been gripped by the revolts since 2010 find themselves in the midst of very chaotic and uncontrollable transitions. So, why these differences? How did countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines achieve relative social and political stability after decades of internal strife, whereas Thailand and Egypt reverted to authoritarian rule after brief democratic interludes? Why did Tunisia succeed in their transition, whereas most countries gripped by the Arab Spring fever did not? To account for these differences, we propose three major factors. One, an early tradition of civil society organizations, which I lumped under the broad concept of civil society infrastructure in a number of countries, notably Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, and Indonesia, whose resurgence at critical junctures provided a social infrastructure for developing and sustaining broad coalitions of opposition groups. In contrast, the capacity of authoritarian governments in the Middle East to adjust their autocracies as well as to regulate and control the environment in which civil society operates results in what Stephen Heidemann calls authoritarian upgrading. And I'll discuss that a little bit more later. Second, the lack of reform-minded factions in the Thai and Middle East North African militaries with narrowly based allegiances, either to regimes or to particular confessional groups, prevented the formation of anti-regime coalition forces. In the Philippines and Indonesia, segments of the military defected from the regime and aligned themselves openly with pro-democracy forces. You don't have anything close to it in any country in the Middle East. And third, differences in economic and social policies that affirm the co-equal status of ethnic groups as in Malaysia and Singapore, potentially in Myanmar, and a peace framework under negotiations in the Philippines between the Christian North and the Muslim South. In contrast, countries in the Middle East region are riveted by ethnic and sectarian cleavages that have become evident in the distribution of public and private goods, giving rise to deep-seated discontent and hostility. So that's our broad research question, and this is the territory that we are working in by, in the book, teasing out and elaborating on these three factors. There are more, to be sure, but these are the three that we thought were the most salient that we would start with. Okay, so first, definitions. We define transitions as critical junctures, major watersheds in political life that establish certain directions of change and foreclose others in a way that shapes politics for years to come. They're critical because of the void left in the aftermath of regime collapse, and therefore has to be filled immediately with new or surviving political actors. Or if regimes haven't collapsed, but they are threatened with collapse, they have to respond quickly to the impending crisis and thus avert the polarization of forces that could lead to civil war. This is happening all over the Middle East today. It is during these critical moments of transition that politics are reborn and powerful stakeholders compete for control of the political space. Further, political transitions are defined as periods of significant change to produce distinct legacies. These legacies are a result of the crisis or cleavages that have accumulated over time and become apparent from antecedent conditions that have been festering for over long periods but have lain unrecognized and unattended to. So at the moment when crisis erupts and these prior conditions are exposed, the transition occurs as an inevitable process. Thus, when the Tunisian vendor Al-Tayyib Mohammed Al-Bouazizi set himself on fire in an act of self-immolation in December 2010, this laid open the deep divisions not only in Tunisian society, but across the entire Arab world, and would set the whole region aflame. Whatever the outcomes of transitions in the Middle East, we argue, there will be distinct legacies that would change the socio-political landscape of the Middle East for decades to come. The Middle East today is going to, and is in the process of producing these distinct legacies, which we still don't know how that's going to, what that's going to look like. Okay, so let me just go quickly to the three factors that we talked about. Civil society in Southeast Asia and the MENA region. In Southeast Asia, our argument is that there is this latent civil society infrastructure. In Myanmar, for example, and Keiko Tosa has written about this in a paper, there has been a rather massive underground network of students, professionals, businessmen, and monks who over the years conducted what they called reading groups. And that's a picture there of a sangha, or a monastic community of monks conducting reading groups and study sessions. And what has usually been done between the sanghas and their coalitions with students is that they would pass around a book. And the book could be a Buddhist set of Buddhist tenets that have within them messages of resistance, messages of opposition. And these books would be passed around from city to city, from Mandalay to Yangon, etc. And the only requirement was that this book, at the back of it, would have the person or persons who had this book, received this copy, had to write where the city came from. So the last book, for example, in Mandalay, would be sent to Yangon, and the person in Yangon who received it would see that the book had come from Mandalay. So this book of opposition teachings from the Buddhist Sangha constituted the kind of material for discussion. And a lot of these happened in private homes. Okay, so this has been sustained over 50 years, even during the military regime. Buddhist organizations were also at the community level. So every village had a sangha and had a small temple where the monks resided. And through regular Buddhist preachings, these associations form part of the civic life of the social fabric in many countries, including Myanmar. So even within these very tight spaces in Southeast Asia, a lot of these student activists, professionals, businessmen, priests, laymen, monks, etc., found ways to navigate in these tight spaces. One of the Burmese media activists whom I interviewed in 2012 told me, his name is Zaya Tu, and he's editor of the Burmese newspaper The Voice Daily for the past 10 years. He recalls running a newspaper during military rule, and he said, and I'm quoting him, "We push the boundaries and test limits all the time. I run an article which we know might get us into trouble. Many times we are closed down. They've been closed down 4 times. We just wait it out. And then when we reapply for the reopening of our newspaper, it's a hide-and-seek game," he says. "We have been closed down 4 times, but each time we reopen, we continue to test how far we can go." And so this daily newspaper, when the 2012 elections came around, they were seen as one of the first and probably the only credible newspaper, because they had continued over the years to rise up every time that they had been closed down by the military. Zaya Tu is now an invited fellow at Oxford University, and will probably spend about a year or 2 there. In contrast, civil society formation in the Middle East is problematic. Populist authoritarian states up until the Arab Spring have been the norm. The massive oil wealth, particularly of the Gulf countries, provided the engine for state-sponsored welfare scheme, and this largesse has kept their populations relatively quiescent with the free provision of public services and utilities. So some, for example, in Egypt refer to this as Arab socialism. The generous distribution of buyouts, according to the political scientist Eva Berlin, resulted in effective co-optation of the citizenry. Also, the invasion of NGOs in the landscape of countries like Palestine produced what is termed excessive NGOization, which created a professional culture among global elites completely divorced from the social and political contexts of their work. But Mehran Kamrava, an Iranian American who's working out of Qatar in the Center for Regional Studies, and he's been following the events in Iran very closely, wrote this book in 2014 and talks about an intellectual revolution, which he says is quietly taking place among Iranian intellectuals and academics who are fashioning a new discourse that indigenizes the concept of civil society, rooted in tradition, but embraces modernity, is religious, even while it promotes secularism. So academics are worth for something, after all. Finally, there is Tunisia, the bright light in the region, and the role of civil society to continually insert itself and to claim spaces for dialogue, even in the midst of sectarian challenges. And then we go into next chapter, which has to do with the military, and here I used Mark's work quite a bit on Sultanist regimes and also of Terence Lee. In Southeast Asia, the role of the military in political transition has been very prominent, particularly in the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar. In fact, I argue we cannot understand political transitions in these countries without referring to the military. Reformist wings in the military in both the Philippines and Indonesia, in coalition with civil society and the business sector, have been instrumental in the breakdown of authoritarian regimes. Thailand, on the other hand, provides a counterpoint to this argument, given 2 military coups in the 8 years, while Myanmar's transition is still very tenuous. A comparative study on the militaries of the Philippines and Indonesia reveals similarities in the regimes of Marcos and Suharto, both of which were characterized as sultanistic, with exclusivist enclaves of cronies characterized as a narrow distributional coalition. But also what you had outside of this narrow distributional coalition, which Suharto and Marcos both maintained, were professionalized segments of the military. So Bambang Yudhoyono, for example, was chief that time of the Department of Political and Social Affairs, I think, and he had a dialogue with the students. On the day that Suharto was going to resign, he was, according to the story, ordered to shoot on the students, and he says no. In fact, what he did was that he spoke to them. Same thing happened in the Philippines, 1986. Marcos had sent out his military and his helicopters to Camp Crame, where the protesters are gathered. And when the protesters thought that the helicopters were going to shoot them, lo and behold, the first helicopter landed in the middle of the protest venue, and the pilots announced that they were going to defect. In contrast, autocratic rulers in the Middle East employ brutal force in attempts to crush revolts, because rather than sidelining the military, what the autocrats did was that they ensured that key units were commanded by members of the ruling family, the tribe, or the sect. Bashar al-Assad is the quintessential promoter of a very sectarian-based military. His military is completely composed of Alawites who will fight to the death. And now with his alliance with Iran and Russia, he thinks that he's unbeatable. So what this did was that their militaries gave them a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and effectively neutralized the risk of fallout of potential defections in times of crisis. This also cemented the family's tribe or sect's grip on power. And you didn't have this quite in the same way as you did in the Philippines and Indonesia, because I said, outside of that very narrow distributional coalition, you had relatively critical segments of the military who were willing to defect, not shoot, and also to promote an agenda that was in line with the opposition groups. A continuing question throughout this paper, or in our book, was how do you reform civil-military relations in countries undergoing political transitions, particularly the issue of depoliticizing the military and subjecting it to civilian oversight. This remains one of the most critical issues in political transitions that spell the difference between lingering and resurgent authoritarianism as exemplified by Thailand and Egypt. There's still a lot of literature also in Indonesia and the Philippines that the military has not been depoliticized or neutralized, but are rather waiting in the wings. There's, I think Aurel Poisson quite argues this. And the third factor that we looked at is interethnic relations, and this is a very lengthy chapter in the book that, sorry, I don't have time to really go into. But one of the things that is very evident today, and you turn on CNN, BBC, major news networks, is when you talk about the Middle East, it's embroiled in a very intense cross-border sectarian war. These conflicts are further fueled by regional superpower rivalry, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, both countries exerting influence within countries that have sharp divisions between Sunnis and Shias. When we have time a little bit later, I'll tell you the historical background of how that whole conflict came about. The current instability in Iraq and Syria is threatening to spill into other countries, if they haven't already spilled into particularly Libya, Lebanon, and Jordan. The Americans just bombed a Libyan IS training camp, supposedly some 2 days ago. All these countries are drawn into the vortex of conflict and the basis of religious affiliation among their populations. Similarly, Myanmar's conflict between the Muslim Rohingyas and the Rakhine Buddhists seem to mirror the sectarian violence in the Middle East and remains the country's most formidable challenge during Myanmar's political transition. Thailand's problem with the Muslims in the south also remains unresolved. However, other Southeast Asian countries, notably Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines, continue to manage their relations with relative success with ethnic groups despite their diversity. The key to understanding this relative success is in the social and economic policy pursued by these countries. Malaysia's new economic policy is a pro-Malay affirmative action policy that resulted in the emergence of an economically empowered Malay middle class without disturbing the economic fortunes built over decades by the Chinese. However, that's all changing in light of the vigorous anti-corruption campaign against Najib. So a pro-ethnic affirmative action policy does have its limits. Among others, it promotes excessive cronyism and corruption. Indonesia forged a peace agreement with Aceh separatist movement in 2005 through a framework of sharing oil revenues. So unless, in the book we argue that unless countries resolve their identity challenges, political transitions will remain difficult, if not impossible. The sad news, when we were writing this book, we thought that the peace agreement in the southern Philippines was going to be passed. the book is going to print, and last week I find out that it did not pass. So back to the drawing board. The negotiators are back in Malaysia hoping to do a fresh round of peace negotiations with the Muslim South. But I am quite confident that this will not lead to a civil war. Okay, so the question is, what are these countries transitioning to? That's why the title of this book is very deliberate. The historical record in both these regions so far demonstrates that democratization is not a foregone conclusion. Some countries that have experienced political upheavals aimed at ousting authoritarian regimes and replacing them with democratic ones have gotten stuck in what Thomas Carothers termed a political gray zone in a famous essay that challenged the transitology paradigm. And let me just very quickly tell you what the 5 assumptions are in transitology that Carothers says have crashed. Number 1, transitional, and the most important one, is that all these transitional countries, he says, are exhibiting features of feckless pluralism and dominant power politics, rather than genuine political groups engaged in alternation of power. And this is what he's become known for, the term feckless democracy or feckless pluralism, which echoes a little bit what J.S. Furnival wrote in the 1800s about British colonies. He said these are pluralist countries, but they are not pluralist in the sense that the British society is. They are like tropical bazaars, he said. There's lots going on, but and there's a lot of ethnic groups, and they are sort of like meeting in the marketplace and maybe intermarrying each other, but this does not make for a functioning pluralist democracy. Second, the assumed stages of democratic transition has been debunked by historical experience. Rather, what has occurred is a backward, sideways process with no regularity. For example, Thailand. Thailand has had 18 coups or 19. They're on their 17th constitution. And in a space of 6 years, 2006 and 24, in the space of 8 years, they've had 2 successful military interventions. Okay? After a period of about 2 decades of uninterrupted democracy. Third, regular elections that are supposedly deepens legitimacy and accountability have become exercises in promoting patronage politics, while political parties are highly personalistic, transient, and incapable of mobilizing collective sentiment. Number 4, the no preconditions for democracy view is challenged by the reality that there are preconditions, such as structural factors, economic development, past experience with political pluralism, or lack thereof. And 5th, state building is a crucial challenge in transitional countries, which transitologists underestimated. The creation of democratic institutions proved more difficult in the face of weak states, which in turn led to its capture by powerful interest groups, thus defying genuine and substantive democracy. Thus, while some countries experience an authoritarian resurgence, others are quite simply lost. It remains unclear what direction Middle East and North African countries, or for that matter, Myanmar, will move. I've heard this from Daryl many, many times that Philippines has had now about 30 years of democracy, and it is still choking in the stranglehold of the oligarchy, which is composed of about 20 families. So what are the lessons of Southeast Asia? And here we treat this very, very cautiously, because aware of the pitfalls of big comparative analysis, which is not to say that we can't say anything or that we can't make any tentative conclusions, but rather that there are certain possibilities that exist for the Middle East when reviewing the Southeast Asian experience. One is that events inaugurate a breakthrough. We don't know what these events are. I mean, who would have known that this fruit vendor, when he set himself on aflame, was going to trigger an entire regional conflagration? But we do know a few things. when these breakthroughs occur, they are because of an economic crisis, an assassination of a significant public figure, in the case of the Philippines, assassination of the opposition senator Benigno Aquino, a natural disaster of tremendous proportions that reveals state incapacity, death or failing health of an incumbent, a symbolic event with widespread resonance, or inspiration from similar events elsewhere. Supposedly, the 1986 People Power inspired events across East Asia and even Eastern Europe, supposedly. Cyclone Nargis in 2008 in Myanmar, for example, was known to have sparked a liberalization process in Myanmar and ushered a period of ongoing political and economic reform. One of the ex-generals that I interviewed in Myanmar some 4 years ago said that the reason why they did open up the political space in 2012 was because they were worried that the next uprising was going to become a Syria. And they didn't want that to happen because they were not sure that this time they would be able to manage the brutality and the reception and the repression. So one primary lesson from this comparative study is that civil society is indispensable in building the necessary political constituency for democracy. But new democracies are beleaguered by old regime forces. Civil society's participation is even more necessary during such period to prevent the forces of authoritarianism from subverting gains and to preserve newly opened but fragile aspects of civic life. The ouster of dictators is only the first, and perhaps the easiest, but it is not the most important step. Many states who experienced democratic transitions inherited institutional weaknesses and often a collapsed economy. As a result, the rehabilitation process in the immediate aftermath of a democratic uprising is bound to be painfully slow and tortuous as the weaknesses of the state become more apparent with greater transparency and openness. Indonesia, for example, is a very good example. It's a very good illustrative case. Following Suharto's resignation in 1998, which was preceded by an economic crisis provoked by the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the economy contracted by 14%. Inflation rose to 80%. The wild swing of the Indonesian rupiah against the US dollar in the range of 5,000 to 17,000 severely eroded Suharto's legitimacy. And I remember we were watching this in Manila on the day that the IMF was, Michel Camdesu was standing behind Suharto, and every minute that he announced he would not resign, the rupiah was just going up and up and up. As caretaker of the successor government, his vice president, B.J. Habibie, decided that he was going to undertake a far more gradual transition process. One, he was going to prepare for elections in 1999, just a year after the demise of the Suharto regime. I mean, Thailand military is still talking about when they're going to have elections, and they're already 2 years late. And second, he stabilized the rupiah into the value between 7,000 and 9,000 to the US dollar, which gave the country a much needed breathing space to manage other transition processes. Civil society in Indonesia helped to develop a public discourse to ensure that the idea masyarakat sipil as a guaranteed realm of freedom from state interference could take deeper root. It enabled the Habibie caretaker government in its first year to lay the foundation of electoral democracy and avert state failure. That's why the lesson for pro-democracy domestic and internal forces in the Arab world is the need to create, maintain, and sustain civil society activity beyond protests and demonstrations after the removal of dictators. And Tunisia has been quite successful in doing this. The Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative meets every year in European countries, in Norway, which I attended in 2014. And it's a network of Iraqi organizations that include labor unions, international donors, and partners. And it serves as an example of civil society to rebuild Iraq in the face of seemingly intractable conflicts. One of their innovative measures was to address sectarianism through a campaign called Ministries Without Quotas. The activists propose that 4 ministries, education, higher education, culture, and sports, be exempted from quota system and headed by independent MPs and technocrats. Though not a sweeping measure to eradicate sectarianism, the proposal could help build confidence in the Iraqi civil service by insulating portions of it from the politics of ethnic quotas. So in other words, some of those ministries will not be allocated the position based on whether you're a Sunni or a Shia. And as I said, it's a first step. But the lessons of Southeast Asia have likewise to be taken a little bit more seriously and with caution. Mutia Alagapa has asserted that civil society does not always promote democratic goals. In fact, some of it does not advance transition and could even contribute to its regression. Thailand provides a negative example. The deep cleavages in Thai society are reflected in the formations of the red shirts and the yellow shirts, and there's not going to be any resolution of that anytime soon. Intense power struggles between these competing social movements and overall polarization of society have invited military intervention on 2 occasions, ending what would have been the longest democratic period in Thailand since a democratic elected government took over in 1992. Tunisia has fared better than Thailand, and in this regard, ironically, Thailand has a lot to learn from Tunisia. This is my favorite phrase, the morning after. What do you do when 3 days, 4 days, 11 days you've camped out in the square and the dictator has fled? The death and departure of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, Libya's longtime dictator, may have brought exhilaration and relief to the country and international community, but it has raised unexpected problems in the aftermath of his demise. The deterioration and chaos in Libya is symptomatic of what dictatorial regimes leave in their wake: a sheer lack of institutions that can be depended upon to govern and regulate social and political life, regardless of who is at the helm. This is the foremost problem of transitions. When the leaders depart, protesters face the mundane reality of running a country on an everyday basis and managing the precarious task of transition. Constitutions must be written and ratified, elections prepared for. Public officials, whether appointive or elected, need to be retooled in the practice of democratic governance. In the economy, there are the perennial problems of employment and underemployment, the question of investments, the distribution of assets, the creation of wealth that will enable the government to finance its programs for citizens' welfare. Most of all, perpetual poverty that stalks majority of its citizens ought to be addressed by thoroughgoing structural change, regardless of the kind of political system that claims it best to deliver them. Here is the true and difficult task of transitions and the valuable lessons of Southeast Asia. Activists are least prepared for the mobilization of human and material resources required for institution building after a popular uprising. Transition societies are not tabula rasa. Rather, they are hybrid social systems that contain elements of the old order, with some very large leftover remnants at that. To treat the transition as though it were a revolutionary situation in which new rules of the game can be rewritten has raised unnecessary expectations and dashed hopes of many pro-democracy activists who become quickly disillusioned by the reality of a hybrid, imperfect, and highly flawed political process. The experiences, again, of Indonesia and Philippines provide best examples. Transitions were, in these 2 countries, at best, improvisations. They contained elements culled out of the idiosyncrasies of hybridized political systems. In other words, the new and the old is what you have when dictators depart. This process required enormous compromises, particularly with the forces of the old regime, accommodation and preservation of some of their interests, some of which were unpalatable to the new guards. So the military, for example, Vice President Habibie did not touch military interests in the transition of Indonesia in order to avert state failure. Corazon Aquino did something a little bit similar, but she was also plagued still by 7 coup attempts. In both countries, elements of the old elite returned to the electoral arena and ran for political office alongside the new candidates. In the newly constituted parliaments, old enemies sat side by side in the halls of discussion and debate to move the country forward through an institutionalized process of lawmaking. Witness Myanmar today. Parliament is a curious admixture of large segments of the military alongside their former enemies, pro-democracy activists who decided to leave the parliament in the streets and enter the messy world of party politics. The third lesson. In the morning after situation when protest sites have been emptied, the activists need to make important political choices. I call it the politics of the boardroom. where a few hundred decision makers, rather than millions of street protesters, undertake the tasks of creating, allocating, and distributing public goods and services. These require joining the executive branch, particularly its messy tangle of bureaucratic offices and agencies. Holdovers from the old regime are bound to interact with the new entrants. The ability to seek common ground and to prevent bureaucracy from being held hostage by competing forces so that ordinary citizens can rely on continuous and uninterrupted services is a task that requires different leadership skills. In addition, new entrants need to learn very quickly the mechanics of managing large organizations, steering them towards the accomplishment of concrete goals, and marshaling the human and other material resources to fulfill socio-economic objectives. Former activists in Indonesia and the Philippines have joined ministries and public commissioners and pursued long-term careers in government. Some of them are my friends and they're still there 20 years after. They sit in national committees, they run budgets, they attend legislative hearings, they negotiate with donors, they create committees to decide on projects, they work with the media and academics to ensure that government serves the public. Joining government is not a straight path. Instead, it is littered with many uneasy compromises. Going out into the street, carrying a placard, and staying there for 4, 7, 12 days, that's far easier. And finally, the lesson, the most important one, Southeast Asian autocracies, despite repression, boasted a far more resilient civil society when reform-minded military elements entered into partnerships with them. Southeast Asia was able to develop a relatively robust and even clandestine civil society because they had coalitions with reformist elements in the military. In the Philippines, the RAM, the Reformed Armed Forces Movement, operated underground with civil society and social movements during the period of martial law. And this is my last slide. So I call this a comparative study, but it's really a study in contrasts. Why Southeast Asia is relatively successful compared to the Middle East is because there is no subgroup of regional powers that are seeking to influence the outcome of transition anywhere in the region. We don't have an Iran or a Saudi Arabia competing for influence. There are no proxy wars that you have in Syria or in Yemen, and increasingly in Libya. The role of external powers did not reduce the likes of jihadist groups such as the Islamic State, although there are worries that might be arriving at the shores of Southeast Asia via Indonesia and Malaysia, but that's being really carefully monitored. Southeast Asia was a backyard of Cold War rivalry during the post-World War II period and dictated much of the conflict between and among countries in the region. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, the conflict diminished and disappeared, and a far more robust regional integration process ensued, with no country or group of countries attempting to impose its dominance. Despite the flaws of the ASEAN and even disagreements among countries, this regional bloc has evolved into a mechanism for promoting a workable arrangement governed by institutionalized rules and procedures, and some would say over-institutionalized and over-proceduralized. 60 committee meetings at least per year. But the issue of territorial sovereignty is always off the table. Oops, sorry. Alex Bellamy has described what I think is the most striking feature of Southeast Asia's transition today. We have no mass atrocities. This is what he describes as the other Asian miracle. It is a region in the last 4 decades that has employed a more peaceful present, leaving behind a violent past. There are no overt conflicts within and among nation states, nor are there border disputes that would pit nation states against each other. Yes, the Cambodian genocide did happen in 1975, and that's being reckoned with imperfectly through the UN tribunal, who are trying the holdovers of the Pol Pot regime, and they have convicted 1, and some more are undergoing trial. Even the invasion of Sabah in 2013 by the forces of Sultan Jamalul Kiram in the southern Philippines was largely resolved without creating antagonisms either between the Philippines or Malaysia. It was, according to The Economist, an invasion, and as amphibious assaults go, according to The Economist, admittedly tame, and later on called it as an armed publicity stunt. The battlefields of the 60s and the 70s in Southeast Asia have been transformed into a vibrant competitive marketplace, with formal and informal institutions to mediate and facilitate inter-regional relationships. It is a truism today that the so-called peace dividend in Southeast Asia has converted past warriors into entrepreneurs and consumers, and where current generations engage in the competition for market share rather than the struggle for military supremacy and territorial conquest. It is perhaps these features of the other Asian miracle that constitute the starkest contrast between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tess, for that wide-ranging comparative analysis. I have to comment that it's refreshing to hear Southeast Asia spoken of in a political sense positively, given all the bad news recently in Thailand, for example. But everything is relative, as you say. We have plenty of time for questions. I'm sure there will be many wanting to follow up with various aspects. I see we have an audience of both those interested in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, so please feel free to ask about either region or both. Well, if while we're gathering our, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you talked about civil societies, and I would be interested where you see differences in the internal structures of civil society within Southeast Asia and the Middle East. I mean, you talked about the Sangha, and you talked about the Sangha in Myanmar, and kind of similar organization in the Middle East, but where else do you see differences and similarities?
Okay, Malaysia. Malaysia, according to Eric Weiss, has a history of civic life even during the colonial period. And this began with rural associations around farming, sewing circles, choral groups. People were getting together quite frequently. In Indonesia, it was much more structured. There were the Aliran movements. Aliran is sort of a, how to describe it? It's a stream of many different organizations, some of which are political, others are not. And the non-political ones give credit, for example, to fellow farmers in the rural areas. Some loan money so that their children can go to school. Some operate purely philanthropically. But at the upper end of the Aliran, and there are two, the Muhammadiyah and the Nurhatul Ulama, NU, which are still very active, by the way, provide a whole range of functions, activities that somehow help integrate social life, especially for those who are marginalized. And that you have still ongoing in Indonesia. In the Philippines, there has been a tradition very, very deep, especially during the American period, of associations of cottage industries at the lowest level, but also in the 1960s and the 1970s, because of the American-Vietnam War, was a very strong, vibrant student movement that, among other things, protested the war, but also promoted a culture of rebellion. And there were also two big streams, the National Democratic Movement that was more aligned with China and Russia, the communist movement, if you like, and there was a social democratic movement that was aligned with Latin America, liberation theology. And you have these streams that are continuing today to influence the formation of other civic groups. So my argument in this chapter was that where you had this civil society infrastructure, even during periods of very close, constricted political space, that infrastructure was mobilized when the public space opened. In the case of the Philippines, during the assassination of Benigno Aquino, that drove a lot of citizens out into the streets, these social movements were there to galvanize and organize that action. You don't have anything like that in the Middle East, and I'm overstating it. You do, but Asaf Bayat calls it the non-civil society, the non-social movement and the uncivil society. And he calls it the leaderless, fragmented, ideology-free agrupations of, for example, urban poor people who take over public spaces. And he said that this is not a political project. These urban groups, urban poor groups, when they take over space, they're not interested in regime change. They're interested in community level services, by and large, that they provide for themselves. At the other extreme, you have this excessive NGOization, where international donors in Palestine, in Egypt, register all of them, and they become very professionalized, depoliticized, and therefore remain detached and disconnected from social and political context. So what you have in Southeast Asia and the Middle East are really sharp contrasts in the quality of civic life, where in Southeast Asia you have historical possibilities that have been historically shaped to engage in politics, whereas in the Middle East you have civic life that has been co-opted and corporatized by the state to promote state-sponsored agendas.
Following on from that question, is there anybody or any organizations or any kind of form of civil society in the Middle East and North Africa? Because from my personal understanding is that North Africa has a very strong tradition of civil society and student movements as well as union movements.
Right.
So it's maybe, as you said, perhaps overstating
Yes.
the extremes in the
Right.
Middle East and North Africa.
See, Tunisia does have a strong tradition, and increasingly more and more active in terms of trying to ensure that sectarianism does not take very deep root, and trying to promote a more secular agenda. Morocco, there is some. There are women's movements in Morocco. There are judges who are promoting civil society through the rule of law. You can even argue that Egypt does have. I think what is the more crucial question is the autonomy. I'm using a Habermasin definition in terms of talking about civil society as a sphere of public life that is independent and autonomous of the state. So it's not whether you have a lot of NGOs and a lot of social movements that are registered, it's more, can they operate within a space that is relatively free and autonomous of state interference? That you have, I argue, in Southeast Asia. You may not have quite that kind of autonomy and separation in the Middle East. And sure, yes, I mean, there are sports groups, for example, and committees, and you even have human rights committees in these countries. But by and large, they are state-sponsored and state-controlled, and therefore the agenda cannot be viewed as separate, from the state.
Bill?
Yeah, I must say I'm really struck by the scale and the ambition of this project, and I must wonder too. I look at Southeast Asia, and it's such a diverse region by itself, and I wonder if you might be better off by beginning comparing some of the countries in Southeast Asia against one another. I mean, you're treating it as sort of an undifferentiated mass. You've boiled 3 lessons out of it, and then you want to transfer these to the Middle East. I wonder if you might begin by, sort of problematizing and examining Southeast Asia a little more closely. So, for example, what lessons does Indonesia have for democratizing Myanmar? What lessons maybe does Cambodia have for, transitioning Vietnam? And after you've fleshed out some of that and seen some of the differences and then made some more fundamental points, then you might begin to transfer this to other parts of the world. But I think there's a lot more exploration that needs to be carried out inside of Southeast Asia before you start to... If you're looking at other more homogeneous regions, I don't know, like Central Asia or maybe South America, you could then compare this with Eastern Europe, as many people did. But I don't think that Southeast Asia lends itself quite to this same kind of wholesale, transferable comparability like your project suggests. So I'm just thinking that maybe you should start there first.
Very well taken. Muthiah Alagaba has written an extensive volume comparing Southeast Asia civil society. And almost all countries are represented there. It's 1994, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's been done. I think what is enriching about a study like that is that if it could go across the region, because Southeast Asia talking to itself, honestly, it's not interesting. I mean, you know, however we might look at it, it's a relatively peaceful place. I mean, people are not killing each other. And I don't know that rehashing that theme all over again would be useful. But I do take your point that there are, for sure, chapters that are missing in this book. One, for example, that I thought we should write, given the time, is to look more deeply into the levels of economic and social development between and among these countries and how different they are. Sure, Laos, Vietnam, can you really compare them? Indonesia, can you compare Indonesia to Laos? I mean, 5 million versus 285 million, okay? But also the interesting story there is why, for example, did East Asia and Southeast Asia produce developmental states, given lack of resources, and produce spectacular development outcomes, compared to the Middle East, where they had oil, far more than any of these Southeast Asian countries, and not develop the kind of developmental states that would promote high levels of development, except for Israel. And I thought that's an interesting story. That's an interesting question. So I agree with you, let's go deeper. But I also would say, having seen and reviewed and analyzed and understood that richness and that depth, that let's move outside this region. Because after all, it's not a big one. By the way, in talking to our editor, there are separate books that are going to be spun out of the individual chapters. So my co-author is going to write a book on Arab militaries and do something comparative. I'm going to do, I hope, comparative civil society, Southeast Asia with the Middle East, and really dig deeper into your question. Morocco, Tunisia, are they the same? And also look at the ethnic compositions of these countries. But thank you. Yes, I truly respect and agree with that comment.
Ian?
Thank you for fascinating talk. I have a question. What do you think about the difference maybe between Southeast Asia and Middle East and the role of the religion and nationalism? Because maybe, because of the different international factors, there is the link between nationalism and the religion, and this influenced the direction of the civil society, right? Like how democratic it is.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Chapter 3, the inter-ethnic rivalries, was the most difficult to write. I had to go into the historical background of the rivalry between the Sunnis and the Shias, and to my surprise, it all came down to a question of succession. When the Prophet died in the 7th century, there was a quarrel between his son-in-law and his most trusted lieutenant. And those who wanted to preserve the bloodline went to the Sunni camp, and those who felt that the most capable, his trusted lieutenant, went to Iran and founded the Safavid. And this was the basis. Now, supposedly that rivalry infuses a lot of social life today, but some other political scientists, Fanar Haddad, for example, will argue this has been used by the autocrats to preserve themselves in power. Because the real struggle is not Sunni Shia, the real struggle is control over the state and control over the resources. And he would quote, because he's Iraqi British, he would say, the Iraqi society of several decades ago had Sunnis and Shias and Salafis and Wahhabis who were able to live together somewhat uneasily, not always harmoniously, but have been able to work out an arrangement by which they could decide on how the use of that public space was going to be distributed in a relatively equitable way. I mean, Lebanon has 13 confessional groups, for example, and, well, it's not a failing state. So you have the Sunni-Shia rivalry that is now becoming the predominant narrative, if you like, that, according to some scholars, is being manipulated by autocrats for self-preservation. And that's why to reduce the Middle East to a purely Sunni-Shia rivalry is really being very reductionist, and that there is more that needs to be looked at in terms of how power is being maldistributed by the autocrats that have been manipulating this for decades.
Romain.
I think my question has been answered.
Yes.
I'm not very clear concerned with the Sangha Association. Did you name it CSO? If it is, how do you define Sangha Association as CSO, to be CSO?
Okay, I'm using Muthiah Alagapa's definition because I think it's the most practicable one. CSO is the general term to connote all activities that are not in the realm of family, market, or the state. And in terms of political activity, Alagapa calls social movements within civil society as the explosive civil society, and he uses this term. So when civil society becomes political and becomes challenging and uses the civicness of the association to challenge existing authority, then that term is now used as a social, the proper term is social movement. The Sangha is, in non-political terms, a part of civil society because it helps organize non-state, non-market life in the rural areas in Myanmar, but also in the urban areas, so that around the Association of Monks are a whole host of other social activities. When they became politicized and joined the marches of 1988, 2007, 2012, then that portion of the civic life of the Sangha became social movement. And this is the way Keiko Tosa is using it, that the explosive character of civil society is what we refer to as social movements. Some of today, the 369 movement by Wiratu is also a Sangha, but has really undertaken a very political campaign that has the bearings of sectarianism in their struggle against what they perceive to be a growing Muslim menace. So in that respect, the Sangha has left the realm of civil society as an arena for the expression of private interest, and has become more of a social movement in terms of challenging what they perceive to be power or imbalance of power relations. Not sure that I answered your question.
If I can follow up on a couple of comments that were made by several of the other questioners, is when we try to compare civil society and talk about the sort of the important differences, maybe it would be or at least in my mind, it might be helpful to break down the comparison to, say, paired comparisons. So if we take Egypt and Thailand, and there I see some very interesting similarities. I mean, both countries have a long history of military rule, military intervention. Both countries have, plenty of traditions of which autocrats can build on, and yet both have seemingly very vibrant civil societies which overthrew autocrats. Of course, in the case of Thailand, it was back to 1992, but more recently in Egypt. But it seems to me the crucial similarity was that you had these civil societies that all of a sudden became uncivil, in the sense that they turned against democracy because they felt very threatened by those who'd come to power electorally. Of course, the Islamist government in Egypt, but the equally feared, from the Thai elite perspective, populism of Thaksin. And I mean, these are fairly elected leaders who arguably, even if they bent democratic rules, didn't break them. They were following the rules of the game to some extent anyway, but civil society, which seemingly had fought so hard for democracy, turns against it. And it seems to me the story there is about civil society changing its mind and just saying, well, if we don't get the elected leaders we want, that'll be the end of democracy. And the story about the military is very much, of course, the military has its own vested interests in both countries, but they follow civil society, and civil society provides them with the cover, also with the protest potential and so on. You saw it in Bangkok, but it was also true in Egypt, and also a kind of international legitimacy because the people have turned against the government. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that as a way that, you know, civil society turns out to be, as it were, the bad guy in those two stories.
Right. Yes. Well, as I said in the previous slide, that there is a regressive character to civil society, and this is exemplified by Thailand, and to a large extent in Egypt as well. I think there's a crucial component here because, focusing on just on civil society is really very insufficient. I mean, Edward Aspinall argues this, that, and Vedihas and Dick Robeson argues that, in Indonesia, when the crunch came and Suharto stepped down, civil society was nowhere. I mean, they were not even part of the actual overthrow. It was really the military and the businessmen and the oligarchs. But Edward Aspinall also says that one crucial role of civil society in Indonesia was that over the years, very quietly, they had created the space for a discourse in which dictatorship was no longer legitimate because of failing economic policies. And by continuously creating that discourse, suddenly the notion of legitimacy was under attack. It was no longer acceptable that Indonesia be ruled by a dictatorship. And that was what he considered to be the contribution. But the warm bodies and the taking down, no, they argue, they had not, civil society had nothing to do with it. So I think the lesson here is that in Egypt, I mean, James will tell you this, all those guys who were out in Tahrir Square were not willing to make compromises, number one. Number two, because that civil society in the era of Facebook and internet is markedly and qualitatively different. These were, to a large extent, leaderless, formless, and maybe even ideology-free. Pretty much like the Occupy movement in New York. And so whereas you have far more formalized organizations in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia and even in Malaysia and in the Philippines, you had this kind of amorphic and amoebic associations that were very malleable and very flexible. And what that did was that you did not have a coherent strategy for dealing with governments, with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Morsi, and also with the military. And so when Sisi came into power, the pro-democracy activists didn't really quite know what to do. They were left to at a disadvantage because those who recaptured the state were remnants of the old regime. And because being threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood and their Islamist followers decided to cast their lot with the authoritarian government. Thailand is a story in which the military and the royalty pretty much continues to dominate Thai politics. And the red shirt formation in the Northeast did not stand a chance, even if they won the elections for 9 years. And because of the intractableness of the relationship between the red shirts and the yellow shirts, and the capture, by the way, of the constitutional courts, there is really very little space now left for the red shirts to maneuver themselves into the political space. And honestly, if you ask me what's going to happen to Thailand, it's probably going to be a bloodbath, I think. and that political transition is probably headed into much more violence than we expect. Now, where is civil society's role in this? Well, I think it's up there. I consider the Yellow Shirts very regressive and very anti-democratic, in spite of their acronym PAD, People's Alliance for Democracy. And there is no room left in Thai society for any kind of moderation and compromise between these two formations, which is pretty much what you find in, in large parts of the Middle East, minus Tunisia.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Can I add that I think maybe one of the things that also should be considered in the case of Egypt is the influence, external influence, especially the U.S. providing some form of legitimacy to a democratically elected leader. So when the Muslim Brotherhood political wing was elected, the U.S. refused to meet with this new leadership, despite the fact that this person was chosen by the people. And the Muslim Brotherhood, you could argue, was actually underground civil society for a very long time, providing all different kinds of services that the government did not for a lot of people in Egypt. So that would be kind of an important factor, I think, in explaining a lot of differences between the Middle East, which is in itself a Middle East, and I'm saying Middle East and not and North Africa, of course, but it's a very kind of like a diverse region with with so many different ways of understanding things. And the fact that maybe the Gulf oil-rich countries, something happened there, but would not happen somewhere else. It's like there's so many there's so much variety there.
It's very complex.
So it's really hard to kind of distill it down to one thing. For example, that oil, the oil money somehow was able to kind of pacify the population, perhaps in the Middle East, and then, perhaps in the Gulf region. So you could talk about Bahrain, maybe, but I don't think that really worked in, for example, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on.
The chapter that is important but is not written up, because that again is a spin-off for a book, is the role of geopolitics and the international community, and now increasingly more and more Russia's role. I mean, these are forces, external forces, that are really reshaping the region in a way that we did not see in Southeast Asia. And this is the problem, I think, of writing a book. We're 7 months after we submitted this, and the reality on the ground has changed. Not very radically, hopefully, but when we wrote this book, Tunisia had just been awarded. Now it was before the attack on the beach. Russia has not joined the fray yet, and Libya has not been bombed by the U.S. So I think there's always this dilemma with academics on how current you want to be versus. And all the information being there versus, deadlines of publishers that they want to print out this book quickly.
Roman?
Going back to the question of religion, you mentioned religion as an explaining factor, but I can't help but wonder if it's not underemphasized in your explanation. I have the impression that religion is the major difference between Southeast Asia and the Middle East. I have the impression in the Middle East, religion and politics are always entangled. Be it as the basis of legitimacy for governments in Saudi Arabia or in Iran, or even for secular military regimes. It's simply that in the end they're the lesser evil of the Islamists in Egypt particularly. And I have the impression in Southeast Asia there's just this entanglement of religion and politics is just not present. And that's, for me, the main difference between these two regions.
That's a really tough one. It's only now that I'm looking at religion as a real social political factor. And because I don't speak Arabic, I don't know Islam, so I'm very careful venturing into this territory. But you're right, as you said, a lot of scholars are defining Middle East politics just really in terms of religious affiliation, or what they call confessional divisions. And there's a lot of debate around that. There are a group of scholars who will argue, as you are, that that is really a clear dividing line, and you can't understand Middle East politics without factoring in religion, but you can understand Southeast Asian politics leaving religion out. I tend to agree more with Fanar Haddad when he says, you know, the control is over state power, and religion is being used as an excuse to foment and to preserve privilege. Because when you look at Bahrain, for example, Bahrain is largely Shiite,
Yeah.
even if they are a minority. But because of Saudi Arabia's support because of the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, this region has become a battleground for their proxy wars. And so you will have really crazy configurations, like you have Bashar al-Assad's Alawite regime, which is very, very, very minority, controlling an entire country. And we're not even talking about the Kurds, by the way. We have missed them out. I mean, Turkey, the same thing. This whole struggle between Islamists, Fethullah Gulen and Erdogan, is not a battle over religion. I mean, they're both Islamists. It's a battle over control of the state. So I guess in each and every country you can cite where religion might be prominent, but then there's going to be a counter example in which in another country, you know, religion does not factor in at all. So I think we need to be a little bit careful, I think, when we throw in religion as the defining narrative of the relationships between these countries. Even if I would be the first to say, by the way, that in my review of Philippine history, what is very prominent is McKinley was a Protestant who engaged the Protestant congregation within the United States to promote the wholesale acquisition of the Philippine Islands as a colony in 1903. Sure, religion was very much a factor there. But even so, you know, I'd like to be careful, especially in a region as volatile and as complex as the Middle East.
What do you think explains that Southeast Asia was able to manage diversity, different ethnic groups inhabiting the same country better than most of the countries in the Middle East, where the divide has erupted so violently?
My example would be Singapore. Probably the most successful, with all its relatively with all its problems. 3 policies. One is housing. You don't have ethnic enclaves in Singapore. It's not allowed. And this is where the state is really very activist and very interventionist. Number 2, in language. Both Malay and Chinese are considered as national language, but the official language of commerce and education is English. The national anthem is in Malay. The language of business is in English, and some of the schools have adopted Mandarin as the Chinese language, even if there are 4 different linguistic groups, Hakka, Hokkien, Chuchao, and Fujian. But they have erased the linguistic differences and decided it was only going to be Mandarin, Tamil, and Bahasa. And then in education, they have removed the differences in the schools, so that all the Chinese schools now are only teaching Mandarin, but as a second language, and also Bahasa. This has promoted a kind of, and also, by the way, the state is very concerned about maintaining that racial quota in everything, even in government. 77% Chinese, 75 to 77% Chinese. What's it? 75, 12, and 12. 75, 12 Malay, and 12 South Asian. And that is especially in the housing. So that you will, and even in the secondary market, you're not allowed to sell to just anyone you want. It has to go through a racial check, because the whole idea is that you really don't want to create, Chinatowns and Malay towns and South Asian towns. And in that respect, I think they have been relatively more successful than the Philippines. What Indonesia and the Philippines did was they entered into peace agreements. Indonesia has been hugely successful with Aceh, and the Philippines is still ongoing. It continues to run into hiccups, but I'm optimistic that somewhere down the road we're going to have a peace agreement very soon.
On that optimistic note, I'd like to call this fascinating session to an end. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you again for this fascinating talk.